The dog hadn't eaten in 11 days. Not a bite, not a sip of water, unless someone physically placed the bowl under his nose, and even then he'd just stare at it like it was something foreign, something that didn't belong to the world he was living in anymore. His name was Ajax, a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, 48 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and whatever it is that lives inside a working dog after years of downrange deployments. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Syria. He'd cleared buildings, tracked insurgents through mountain passes in the dark, and once, according to the paperwork that came with him, he'd pulled his handler out of a drainage ditch after an IED took out the left side of a Humvee. Dragged the man by the collar of his vest, wouldn't let go until medevac arrived. That handler was Staff Sergeant Owen Marsh, and Owen Marsh was dead. Not from the IED, he'd survived that. He'd survived all of it, actually. 3 deployments, 2 commendations, a partial hearing loss in his right ear, and a scar along his jaw that he always said came from a fence post on his uncle's farm, which nobody believed. Owen Marsh had come home. He'd made it back to Clarksville, Tennessee, married his high school sweetheart, started going to the Lutheran church on Route 41 every Sunday morning. He'd retired from the Army at 39 and started working at a landscaping company. And then, 14 months later, a pickup truck ran a red light on a Tuesday evening, and that was the end of Owen Marsh. Ajax had been transferred to the Hardin County K-9 facility outside Savannah. Not the Georgia Savannah, the Tennessee one, smaller and quieter, while the Army figured out the next step. The facility was clean and well run. The staff were trained. They knew what they were doing. Nobody there was careless or unkind. It didn't matter. Ajax lay in the back corner of his kennel and faced the wall. The first 2 days, the staff thought he was adjusting. The 3rd day, they got a little concerned. By the 5th day, the senior handler, a woman named Corporal Bryce with 8 years of K-9 experience, had tried every protocol in the book: regimented feeding schedules, high-value rewards, slow approach, no eye contact. She'd even tried sitting outside his kennel door for 2 hours reading out loud from a paperback novel, because she'd heard somewhere that the sound of a calm human voice could sometimes reach a grieving dog in ways that commands couldn't. Ajax didn't move. The consulting veterinarian, a younger man named Dr. Foss, came out on day 7. He checked Ajax's vitals, looked at his eyes, palpated his abdomen, drew blood. Everything came back within normal range, or close enough. There was no infection, no organ failure, no tumor pressing on something it shouldn't. Dr. Foss stood outside the kennel with his clipboard and said, very carefully, that the dog was in a state of acute psychological withdrawal, and that if it continued, the physical decline would become irreversible. The body, he said, could only sustain itself on grief for so long. Corporal Bryce asked what they should do. Dr. Foss looked at his clipboard. He said there were some newer behavioral intervention protocols developed at a research facility in Colorado. He said he could make some calls. He mentioned something about therapeutic scent exposure and phased reintegration methods and neuroassociative conditioning. Ajax lay in his corner and faced the wall. By day 9, Corporal Bryce had driven to the Army base and retrieved Owen Marsh's old patrol vest from storage, still signed out to him, still carrying his scent, and placed it at the edge of the kennel. Ajax had turned his head, just slightly, just enough to know he'd registered it. Then he'd turned back to the wall. That was the closest thing to a response they'd gotten. Day 11 was a Thursday. Corporal Bryce was standing in the facility's small break room, staring at a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink, when Nora Galloway knocked on the doorframe. Nora was the facility's admin coordinator. 52 years old, red-headed going silver, with a no-nonsense quality about her that came from having grown up with 4 brothers and spent 20 years married to a man who thought feelings were something you mentioned once and then moved on from. She was good at her job, and she kept mostly to herself, but she had a way of noticing things that other people stepped over. She said there was a man outside. Corporal Bryce looked up. An old man, Nora said. He'd driven up in a truck. A dirty one, she noted, with a cracked windshield and a bale of wire in the back, and he'd parked in the lot and sat there for about 10 minutes before coming to the door. He hadn't knocked right away. He'd stood on the front step for a minute first, like he was working up to something, or deciding whether to bother. He said his name was Orrin Caulfield. He said he lived about 30 miles out, past the county line, on a small property near Pickwick Lake. He said he'd read about Ajax in the local paper. There'd been a brief piece, 2 paragraphs, about the facility's search for a permanent adoption placement for a retired military working dog, and he wondered if he could come in and see the dog. Corporal Bryce asked if he had any experience with dogs. He said a little. She asked if he had a fenced yard, whether he'd owned dogs before, whether he understood the particular needs of a high-drive military working dog with combat history. He said he understood some things about animals. He said he wasn't sure he could answer the rest without seeing the dog first. Corporal Bryce studied him. Orrin Caulfield was somewhere in his mid to late 60s. It was hard to say exactly, because he was one of those people whose age seemed to have settled into him rather than accumulated on him. Tall, slightly stooped, with hands that told you he worked with them. He wore a canvas jacket that had been washed too many times and work boots that had seen better years. There was nothing remarkable about him, which was itself a kind of remark. He looked like a man who had made a long career of being overlooked. She said fine, she'd take him back. He didn't say anything when he saw Ajax. Most people said something, some exclamation, some note of distress, something to fill the silence that the kennel and the suffering dog created. Orrin Caulfield stood at the kennel door and looked at Ajax for a long moment. Ajax didn't move. Corporal Bryce explained the situation. The 11 days, the not eating, the behavioral protocols they'd attempted. She told him about the vest. She found herself telling him more than she normally would have told a civilian at this stage, because there was something in the way he listened. Very still, very quiet, not performing attention but actually paying it. That made her keep going. When she finished, he nodded once. Then he said, "Mind if I just sit with him for a while?" She said. The kennel door wasn't something she could open for a civilian, for liability reasons, but she could get him a folding chair and he could sit outside. He said that would be fine. She brought the chair. He sat down, close to the kennel mesh, without fanfare, without ceremony. He didn't speak to the dog. He didn't make sounds at him or hold his hand out through the mesh. He didn't read to him or play music or try to entice him with food. He just sat. Corporal Bryce stood back and watched for a few minutes, waiting for him to do something. He didn't. She went back to her paperwork and looked in on them every 20 minutes or so. The first time she checked, nothing had changed. Ajax was still in his corner, back to the door. The second time, Ajax had turned. He wasn't looking at Orrin directly. His head was angled, slightly off-center, like a man listening for something at the edge of his hearing. But he had turned. After 11 days, he had turned. Orrin hadn't moved. He was sitting in the folding chair with his forearms resting on his knees, not looking directly at the dog either, just sort of existing in the same space. Corporal Bryce went back to her desk. An hour passed. She went back. Ajax was sitting up, not standing, not approaching the front of the kennel, but sitting up, upright, his head at a slight angle, his amber eyes on the old man. Orrin still hadn't moved. She went and got Dr. Foss, who was still on site, writing up his notes. He came and looked through the door of the facility. He watched for a moment and didn't say anything. She asked him what he thought was happening. He said he didn't know. 2 hours in, Ajax stood. He stood and walked. Slowly, not urgently, with the careful deliberateness of an animal relearning something, toward the front of the kennel. He stopped about 2 feet from the mesh. He stood there. Orrin looked up then, not at Ajax's eyes. He looked somewhere around the dog's chest, somewhere neutral, somewhere that wasn't a challenge and wasn't a submission, but was just a presence acknowledging another presence. And he said very quietly, something that Corporal Bryce only partially caught from where she was standing. She thought he said, "I know," just that, 2 words, and then he went quiet again. Ajax sat down. He sat down a foot from the mesh, facing Orrin, and the two of them just stayed like that while the Tennessee afternoon got older around them. Around 3 o'clock, Orrin asked if they had a bowl they could put near the front of the kennel. Corporal Bryce brought a bowl of food. She placed it just inside the kennel door. Ajax looked at it. He looked at Orrin. He walked over to the bowl and ate. Not everything, maybe a third of it, but he ate. Corporal Bryce had been doing this work for 8 years. She had worked with dogs that bit without warning, and dogs that cried in their sleep, and dogs that couldn't be touched without trembling, and dogs that had come back from overseas carrying things in them that didn't have names in any training manual she'd ever read. She thought she had a handle on what she was looking at when she walked into a kennel. She thought she could read a situation. She stood in the hallway outside Ajax's kennel with a clipboard she wasn't using and felt, for the first time in 8 years, like she had no idea what she was looking at. She went to find Oren's file, the intake form he'd filled out at the front desk, and she read it again. There wasn't much to it. Oren's James Caulfield, 67 years old, Pickwick Lake area. Single, no current pets, no criminal record, retired. Retired from what? She'd asked Nora. Nora had asked him, apparently. He'd said, government work. Corporal Bryce folded the form in half and thought about that for a minute. She went back out to the kennel. Oren was still in his chair. Ajax was lying near the front of the kennel now, his head on his paws, about 8 inches from the mesh, near enough that if Oren had reached through, which he hadn't, he could have touched him. She sat down on a spare chair a few feet away. She asked him how he'd known. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, I didn't exactly. She waited. He said, I've been around animals enough to know that sometimes they don't need anything done to them. Sometimes they just need someone to not leave. She asked him what he meant by that. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, a working dog, a real one that's been in the field. He's not like a civilian dog. He's not used to comfort as a baseline. He's used to purpose. He's used to a partner. When the partner goes, he's not just sad. He's disoriented. Everything he understood about how the world works is gone. The handlers, the vets, they come in with things to do, interventions, protocols, and that's the right instinct. But a dog that's lost his handler doesn't need another intervention. He needs someone to be present without needing something back from him, without requiring anything. Just available. Corporal Bryce looked at Ajax, who was sleeping now. Actually sleeping. She said, you've done this before. He didn't answer that directly. He said he'd sat with a few animals over the years that needed sitting with. She asked if he'd ever worked with military dogs specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a tone that was entirely neutral, I've worked alongside some. She looked at him, his profile, the set of his jaw, the particular kind of stillness that he carried, which was not the stillness of a man who had nothing inside him, but the stillness of a man who had learned to hold what was inside very, very steady. She said, are you who I think you might be? He smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a man who had been asked versions of that question before and had become comfortable not answering it. He said, I'm just a man with some land near Pickwick Lake who read about a dog in the paper. She nodded. She let it go. That was the better part of wisdom. She was coming to understand, knowing when you'd gotten the answer you were going to get and not pushing past it. Oren came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He'd arrive around 9, park his truck in the same spot, come through the front door without being asked, accept Nora's offer of coffee without being asked twice, and go sit outside Ajax's kennel. Some days for 2 hours, some days for 4. By the 5th visit, Ajax was coming to the front of the kennel when he heard Oren's footsteps in the hallway, not frantically, not like a dog performing reunion, just standing up and walking forward like a soldier who'd heard a familiar voice and turned to look. On the 7th visit, Corporal Bryce opened the kennel door. She did it without a lot of ceremony, without telling Oren in advance. She just unlatched it and stepped back. Oren didn't move from his chair. He waited. Ajax stood at the open door for almost 2 full minutes. He looked at the open space. He looked at Oren. He stepped out. He walked to Oren and put his head against the man's knee. Just that. Just pressed his head there and held it, and Oren put one hand on the back of the dog's head very gently, and nobody said anything. Dr. Foss was there that day. He'd made a point of being there. He watched from the hallway, and afterward he said something about the therapeutic value of consistent low-demand presence, about mirror neurons and co-regulation and the physiological effects of sustained, calm proximity. He used a lot of precise language, and he wasn't wrong about any of it. But Corporal Bryce kept thinking about what Oren had said, about not leaving. The adoption paperwork took 3 weeks. There were procedures to follow, assessments to complete, a home visit from a certified evaluator who drove out to Pickwick Lake and came back saying the property was quiet and secure, and that the applicant seemed to have, in her words, an unusual facility with animals. Nobody argued with that. On the morning Ajax left, Corporal Bryce walked him out to Oren's truck on a lead. It was early, just past 8, and the September light was coming in at a low angle through the pines, making everything look a little golden, a little provisional, the way morning light sometimes does in a place you're leaving. She unclipped the lead. Ajax jumped into the truck bed, turned once, and lay down. She looked at Oren, who was standing by the driver's door with his keys in his hand. She asked if he needed anything. Emergency contacts, feeding guidelines, the number for the vet facility. He said he had everything he needed. She nodded. She almost said something else. Something about what she thought she might know about him, or about Ajax, or about the particular thing she'd watched happen over the past 3 weeks that she didn't have language for. But she didn't. She just put her hand briefly on the truck door and stepped back. He said, "He's going to be all right." She believed him. She didn't entirely know why, but she believed him completely. He got in the truck and drove down the gravel road and turned onto the county road and was gone. Word got around, the way it does in small facilities with small staffs and long days. Not the specific details. Corporal Bryce kept those to herself, but the general shape of it. The dog that wouldn't eat. The quiet old man who came and sat. The door that opened on the 7th visit. People talked about it the way people talk about things they don't have a framework for. With a kind of wondering uncertainty that wasn't disbelief but wasn't quite certainty either. Dr. Foss wrote up a case summary. It was a good document, thorough and measured, and it correctly identified several evidence-based mechanisms that likely contributed to Ajax's recovery. The summary would be useful. It would probably help other dogs someday. But there was a paragraph toward the end where Dr. Foss wrote, in the careful language of a trained clinician trying to be honest, that while the contributing mechanisms could be identified in retrospect, the intervention itself had been neither planned nor replicable in any technical sense, and that the factor most correlated with the animal's recovery appeared to be simply the sustained presence of a particular individual whose precise background and relevant experience remained, as of this writing, unclear. He'd left it at that. Out at Pickwick Lake, the seasons changed the way they do in that part of Tennessee. Not dramatically, but steadily, one thing becoming another without announcement. The leaves came off the hardwoods, and the lake went still and cold, and the mornings started carrying frost in them that wasn't there in September. Orrin's neighbors, the few he had, didn't see much of him on an ordinary basis. He wasn't unfriendly. He'd wave if you waved. He'd stop to talk if you stopped him on the road. But he was a man who kept to himself, and people in that part of the county respected that, partly because they tended to be that way themselves, and partly because there was something in the way Orrin Caulfield moved through the world that suggested he had earned the right to it. Now, in the mornings, they'd see him sometimes, down by the water, just standing at the edge of the dock or walking the path along the lake shore, and the dog would be with him, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. Not on a leash, not commanded, just alongside, like a partner. One morning in November, a neighbor named Whitford, older himself, a retired postal carrier who'd lived on this road his whole life, saw Orrin down by the water and decided to walk over. He wasn't sure why, maybe just to be neighborly, maybe because the mornings were getting long and quiet, and company was something he'd started to value more than he used to. He walked down to the lakeshore and stood beside Orrin for a minute without saying anything, watching the water. Then he said, "Nice dog." Orrin said, "He is." Whitford watched Ajax move along the bank, nose down, unhurried. He said, "What's his name?" Orrin said, "Ajax." Whitford nodded. He said, "Good name for a dog." Orrin didn't say anything. They stood there for a while, the three of them, watching the lake. Then Whitford said, and he wasn't sure why he asked it, it just came out. He said, "You all right, Orrin?" And Orrin looked at him. Not surprised, not guarded, just looked at him the way a man looks when he's been asked a question he wasn't expecting and finds, to his own mild surprise, that he knows the answer. He said, "Yeah, I think I am." Down at the water's edge, Ajax had stopped. He was standing very still, looking out at the lake, and in the November quiet there was nothing moving but the water and the light on it. He wasn't running anywhere. He wasn't searching. He was just standing there, in the cold morning, next to the man who had come and sat beside him when nobody else knew what to do, and stayed.